My brother tossed my suitcase out of a second-story window into the pouring rain just 24 hours after we buried our parents. He stood there with his smug wife holding a forged legal document claiming he owned our family estate. He sneered and told me to enjoy being a homeless college dropout. I did not scream or beg. I simply ordered a ride, sat in the back seat, and opened a hidden bank app on my phone displaying a balance of over $14 million. He had no idea who he had just kicked out. I am Cassidy, 33 years old, and for my entire life I was treated as the ultimate disappointment in a family that worshipped money and status. I survived their toxic environment by staying quiet and building an empire in the shadows. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled my brother's perfect life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to relatives who underestimated your worth. The rain was lashing against the tall Victorian windows of my childhood home in Atlanta when the front door was kicked open. My parents, Thomas and Catherine, had died in a car accident just 4 days prior. I was still wearing my black morning dress, kneeling on the floor of my mother's bedroom. I was carefully packing her vintage pearl necklaces into a small velvet box. I had not even had time to process the devastating void in my chest when I heard heavy footsteps stomping up the oak staircase. Before I could stand, my older brother Brandon stormed into the room. He was 36 years old and wearing a tailored charcoal suit that screamed of the investment director persona he curated for his friends. Right behind him was his wife Naomi, an African-American woman whose beauty was entirely overshadowed by the permanent condescending sneer on her face. Flanking them were two intimidating men in dark windbreakers, looking like hired muscle. "Time is up, Cassidy," Brandon barked, crossing his arms tightly. He did not look like a man who had just buried his parents. He looked like a ruthless landlord collecting a late fee. "What are you talking about, Brandon?" I asked, my voice hoarse, keeping my hands steady over my mother's jewelry box. "The funeral was yesterday." Naomi stepped forward, her expensive stilettos clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She looked down at me as if I were dirt. "What he is talking about, sweetie, is that this house is no longer a charity shelter for you." She spat the words out. "You are just a lowly accounting clerk. Thomas and Catherine paid off your little student loans and you have leached off them enough. Now it is time you give this house back to the one who actually brings glory to this family." An investment director like Brandon needs an estate that matches his portfolio. I did not bother correcting her. I did not bother telling her I had paid off my own student loans through academic scholarships. I certainly did not tell her that I was not a lowly accounting clerk, but a senior forensic accountant who specialized in tracking corporate fraud. That was my guarded secret. In my family, correcting the golden child only ever led to more psychological warfare, so I kept my success hidden. "I am packing Mom's things," I said, my tone completely flat. "I just need a few days to gather my belongings." "You do not have a few minutes," Brandon snapped loudly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded notarized document, shoving it into my face. "I am the executor of this estate. I hold the power of attorney for healthcare and all financial assets. Mom and Dad signed this over to me before they died. This house is mine. So grab whatever cheap clothes you have and get out right now before I have these men throw you out." I looked at the piece of paper he was holding. Even through my overwhelming grief, my professionally trained eyes immediately scanned the bottom of the page. The signatures were there, my mother's elegant cursive and my father's sharp block letters. But something about the notary stamp and the date looked deeply and fundamentally wrong to me. Brandon did not give me time to analyze it further. He signaled the two men standing behind him. One of them stepped forward, grabbed the small suitcase of my personal clothes sitting on the bed, and literally threw it out the open window. The sound of my belongings crashing onto the muddy driveway below echoed through the silent house. Naomi smirked, crossing her arms tightly. "Hope you enjoy the rain, clerk. Go find a cheap motel to cry in." I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not beg. A lifetime of being the family scapegoat had taught me that emotional reactions were currency to people like Brandon and Naomi, and I absolutely refused to make them rich. I carefully closed my mother's jewelry box, left it on the bed, and walked past them without shedding a tear. I walked down the stairs, out the front door, and out into the freezing downpour. I picked up my mud-soaked suitcase, pulled out my phone, and ordered a ride. As I sat in the back of the car with rain dripping from my hair, I opened a hidden banking app on my phone. The biometric scan verified my face instantly. The screen loaded, displaying a balance of over $14 million. I locked my phone and stared out the window at the passing city lights. Brandon had absolutely no idea who he had just kicked out of the house. The rideshare pulled up to the private underground entrance of my residential building in downtown Atlanta. The driver gave me a sympathetic look as I grabbed my ruined suitcase, probably assuming I was heading up to some cramped studio apartment. I thanked him, tipped generously on the app, and walked through the heavy glass doors. The concierge, a discreet older man named Thomas, immediately stepped out from behind his marble desk. He took one look at my soaking wet clothes and mud-splattered shoes, instantly reaching for my bag. I assured him I was fine and stepped into the private elevator keyed to the top floor. The door slid open directly into my 4,000-square-foot penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. I kicked off my ruined shoes, walked across the pristine hardwood floors, and left my wet coat over a chair. Brandon and Naomi thought they had cast me out into the gutter. They thought taking away my childhood bedroom would break my spirit and leave me destitute. They had spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence, assuming my quiet nature meant I was weak. I showered, letting the hot water wash away the mud and the lingering toxicity of that house. I slept soundly for the first time since the accident. The real psychological warfare began the next morning. It was a flawless execution of modern manipulation, designed to sever any remaining ties I had with our extended family. I woke up, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and opened my laptop on the kitchen island. My phone had been vibrating relentlessly since dawn. I had over 50 unread messages, mostly from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had not spoken to me in years. I opened my social media accounts, and there it was, a viral, highly dramatized post written by Naomi. She had attached a staged, mournful photograph of her and Brandon standing in front of my parents' house. Naomi was wearing a designer black dress, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The caption was a masterclass in character assassination. "It breaks my heart to share this in our time of deepest grief," Naomi wrote. But right after the funeral, Brandon's sister Cassidy broke into the house, stole Catherine's vintage jewelry, and emptied Thomas's emergency joint accounts. We are devastated that she would exploit her own parents' death. Because she drained the accounts, we are struggling to cover the final funeral expenses. We have set up a fundraising campaign for anyone willing to help us lay Thomas and Catherine to rest with the dignity they deserve. The comments underneath the post were a toxic wasteland of familial betrayal. Aunt Beatrice wrote a scathing paragraph. "I always knew she was the failure of this family. Brandon, you have a heart of gold for handling this tragedy. I am donating $500 right now." Cassidy should not dare show her face at the will reading on Friday. Cousin Greg immediately replied to her comment. "Unbelievable. She was always jealous of your success, man. Call the cops on her right now and have her locked up." My direct text messages were just as vicious. People I shared DNA with were calling me a thief, a sociopath, and a parasite. Brandon and Naomi were actively weaponizing our parents' death to publicly crucify me. They wanted to isolate me so completely that I would have absolutely no one to turn to. They assumed I was currently sitting in a cheap motel crying over my phone, utterly destroyed by the weight of their social manipulation and public shaming. They expected me to beg for forgiveness or lash out in a hysterical panic. I did neither. I sipped my coffee and booted up my forensic accounting software. It was time to go to work. I started with the fundraising link Naomi had posted. Bypassing the basic public interface, I ran a trace on the IP addresses associated with the account creation and the linked withdrawal routing numbers. I did not just want to know where the money was going. I wanted to know exactly what they were hiding behind this grieving family facade. Within 40 minutes, I had breached the surface of Brandon's financial illusions. The routing number for the donations did not go to a funeral home or an estate account. It bounced directly into an offshore cryptocurrency wallet registered under Naomi's maiden name. But that was not the smoking gun I needed. I pulled up the credit card statements and geolocation data attached to Naomi's public social media presence. She claimed I had stolen my mother's vintage pearl necklaces after the funeral. Digital footprints never lie. 3 days before the funeral, while my parents' bodies were still at the medical examiner's office, Naomi's phone had pinged at an upscale pawn shop and luxury consignment dealer in the wealthy Buckhead district. I hacked into the public property transaction database for that specific dealer, filtering by recent acquisitions. There it was, a scanned receipt bearing Naomi's unmistakable signature, finalizing the sale of a set of vintage pearl necklaces matching my mother's exact description. She had sold them for $12,000 in cash. She had not just framed me for theft, she had looted a dead woman's bedroom before the soil was even turned at the cemetery. Then she used the proceeds to buy the designer stilettos she wore to kick me out of my own childhood home. The absolute depravity of their actions confirmed what I had always suspected. Brandon and Naomi were not just toxic family members. They were actively committing financial crimes, and they were using my parents' tragedy to fund their extravagant lifestyle. I saved the receipt, downloaded the routing data, and created an encrypted folder on my desktop. They wanted to play a game of public exposure, but they had severely miscalculated the skills of the opponent they invited to the table. If Naomi was pawning my mother's jewelry for a quick $12,000, it meant the great investment director was not as wealthy as he pretended to be. I cracked my knuckles and shifted my focus to Brandon. For years, he had paraded around family Thanksgiving dinners bragging about his hedge fund, his brilliant market predictions, and his supposed massive net worth. He loved making everyone feel small, especially me, by flaunting designer watches and leasing expensive luxury cars. It was time to see what was actually funding his lifestyle. I ran a deep dive audit on his primary corporate entities and business tax filings. Using my specialized forensic software, I bypassed the superficial public records and accessed the raw financial data he thought was secure. What I found made my blood run absolutely cold. Brandon was not a millionaire. He was drowning. He had heavily leveraged himself in an alternative cryptocurrency crash 2 years prior. He was currently $4 million in debt. But the true horror was not just the debt. It was exactly how he was keeping his sinking ship afloat. He was running a classic textbook Ponzi scheme. I traced the incoming wire transfers to his primary holding account. He had taken the investment money from Aunt Beatrice's cousin Greg and dozens of other relatives who had just commented on that viral social media post. He was using their new investments to pay off the older investors, maintaining the absolute illusion of high market returns. My family was not defending a successful, generous businessman. They were violently defending the very man who was actively robbing them blind. I picked up my phone and called Harrison. He was the senior partner at my parents' longtime law firm and the personal legal advisor for my own private corporate assets. Cassidy Harrison answered immediately, his voice grave and tense. I saw the social media posts. The entire family is sharing them. Do you want me to file a defamation suit right now? I can have them served by noon. Not yet, Harrison, I said calmly, watching the city traffic far below my window. I need you to verify something first. Brandon kicked me out yesterday using a power of attorney document. He claimed Mom and Dad signed over all assets to him right before the accident. I heard the frantic rustling of paper through the speaker. Cassidy, that is legally impossible. I have your parents' master file right here on my desk. There is no updated power of attorney. If he has a document, it is a complete forgery. But wait. The line went dead silent for a terrifying 10 seconds. Harrison, I pressed. What is it? I am looking at a secondary property lien filed with the county clerk 4 weeks ago, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. Cassidy Brandon did not just forge a power of attorney. He coerced your parents into signing a second mortgage on the family estate to bail out his failing investment fund just weeks before they died. He extracted $500,000 in equity. My vision tunneled. He had not just kicked me out into the rain. He had financially bled our parents dry while they were still alive, forcing them to mortgage their security to cover his criminal gambling. A cold, lethal fury settled in my chest. Let him play his hand, I told Harrison, my voice turning to absolute ice. Schedule the official will reading for this Friday. Tell Brandon he is legally required to attend with the whole family to formally transfer the estate assets. He is going to walk in there thinking he owns the entire world, Harrison warned, sounding deeply concerned for me. I know, I replied. That is exactly what I am counting on. To seal the trap perfectly, I needed Brandon to hang himself with his own arrogance. I needed undeniable proof of his malicious intent, something that would hold up in federal court when the time came. I opened the toxic family group chat on my phone. I ignored the barrage of fresh insults from my cousins and typed out a message specifically designed to stroke Brandon's monumental ego. Brandon, please, I typed, forcing myself to use the desperate broken language he expected from me. I do not have anywhere to go. The motels are too expensive and I am scared. Can you please give me a small fraction of mom and dad's savings? Just enough to make rent this month. I watched the typing indicator appear immediately. Brandon could never resist kicking someone when they were down. He thrived on the power trip. Enjoy the streets, you ugly college dropout loser, Brandon replied in the group chat for all the relatives to see. Mom and Dad knew you were a complete failure. I hold the power of attorney and I am keeping every single red cent. You get absolutely nothing. Do not even bother showing up to the will reading on Friday. I smiled, took a screenshot of his message, and forwarded it directly to Harrison. It was a written, time-stamped admission of his intent to withhold estate assets using a fraudulent document. The trap was perfectly set. He really does not know, does he? Harrison asked me over the phone later that evening. Know what? I asked, leaning back against my kitchen counter. That 3 years ago, when Brandon nearly bankrupted your parents the first time with his failed day trading, they were 90 days away from foreclosure, Harrison said. He has no idea that you stepped in. I looked out at the glittering Atlanta skyline. No, he doesn't. I spent the next 48 hours in total silence, methodically preparing his execution. I compiled a massive digital audit file detailing every single fraudulent transaction Brandon had made over the last 5 years. I traced the stolen funds, the fake returns sent to Aunt Beatrice, the forged documents, and the fake mortgage paperwork. I encrypted the file. I sent the encrypted file through a secure digital channel directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the White Collar Crime Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Atlanta. I included the exact date, time, and location of the upcoming will reading at Harrison's law firm. I did not just want Brandon sued in civil court, I wanted him in handcuffs. I also forwarded the Buckhead pawn shop receipt to Harrison so he could handle Naomi's blatant theft of the vintage pearls. The trap was locked and loaded. With the digital groundwork complete, I reviewed the property documents for the family estate. The irony of Brandon's forged power of attorney was staggering. 3 years ago, when his failed day trading pushed our parents 90 days past due on their mortgage, they came to me in tears. They were terrified of losing the house and ashamed of their golden child. To save them from foreclosure, I quietly established an anonymous corporate entity called Phoenix Holdings. Through that company, I paid off their entire mortgage, legally purchasing the estate from the bank. For the last 3 years, my parents had not owned that house at all. They were legally renting it from my company for exactly $1 a month. Brandon had forged documents to steal a house that already belonged to me. The second mortgage he had fraudulently forced them to sign weeks before their death was entirely void because they did not hold the deed to the property. He had committed federal wire fraud and bank fraud against a property owned by my corporate entity. By Thursday night, everything was in place. I walked into my massive walk-in closet and bypassed the casual, quiet clothes I usually wore around my family to make them feel comfortable and superior. I pulled out a razor-sharp, tailored navy blue trench coat and a pair of designer heels. If I was going to a slaughter, I was going to dress exactly like the executioner. I laid the clothes out perfectly, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. The girl who used to cry in her bedroom, while her brother was praised for mediocre achievements, was dead. The woman standing here was a lethal force of financial accountability. Friday afternoon arrived with a crisp, clear sky. The heavy mahogany doors of Harrison's downtown law firm were imposing, projecting an aura of old money and strict legal authority. I arrived precisely on time, stepping out of my private car and walking into the grand lobby. The receptionist recognized me immediately and nodded toward the massive glass-walled conference room at the end of the hall. As I pushed the heavy glass door open, the air in the room instantly turned toxic. Brandon had brought a massive audience. Naomi was sitting beside him, draped in expensive designer clothes purchased with stolen money. Behind them sat Aunt Beatrice, cousin Greg, and at least 3 other relatives who had dragged my name through the mud on social media earlier that week. They were all there to watch the supposed failure of the family get officially written out of history. They wanted front row seats to my absolute humiliation. When I walked in, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor, the confident aura I projected caused an immediate ripple of confusion across Naomi's face. This was not the miserable girl she had thrown out into the rain. I stood tall, my tailored coat perfectly pressed, carrying a sleek leather briefcase instead of a cheap handbag. Brandon sneered, leaning back in his leather chair. "I told you not to come, Cassidy," he said loudly, making sure the relatives in the back row could hear. "Hope you enjoy being homeless because I made sure you get absolutely nothing today. We are just here to make it official and get the paperwork signed." I did not say a single word in response. I simply walked to the far end of the long conference table, took a seat directly opposite of him, and nodded respectfully to Harrison. The senior partner sat at the head of the table, his expression completely unreadable. Harrison opened his thick leather folder. He completely ignored the forged power of attorney document sitting proudly on the table in front of Brandon. Instead, he pulled out a heavy, blue-backed legal document bound with official seals. "We are here to read the final legally binding directives of the Thomas and Catherine Irrevocable Trust," Harrison announced, his deep voice echoing in the quiet room. Brandon frowned, leaning forward slightly. "Trust? What trust? I have the power of attorney right here." He tapped the fraudulent paper. "A power of attorney expires upon death," Brandon Harrison said coldly, looking over his reading glasses. "And this particular one is a highly fraudulent document. Let us proceed with the actual legal directives left by your parents." Harrison cleared his throat and began reading from the official trust. "To our son Brandon, we leave exactly $0.00. We have paid enough of your debts in life, and we are fully aware of the financial ruin you have brought upon this family." The entire room erupted into chaos instantly. Aunt Beatrice gasped loudly, clutching her chest. Cousin Greg nervously muttered something. Brandon immediately leaped to his feet, his chair crashing backward against the glass wall. He slammed his hands furiously on the mahogany table. "That is a complete lie," Brandon roared, his face turning purple. "This is a setup. That house is mine. I have the paperwork to prove it. I made them sign the second mortgage." Harrison confidently pushed a different stack of legal papers across the table. "You have absolutely nothing here," Brandon Harrison stated, his stern voice slicing through the shouting. "The family estate does not belong to your parents. It has not belonged to them for 3 years. It belongs entirely to Phoenix Holdings." Brandon stared at the legal documents, his mouth opening and closing. "I do not care about some random shell company," he screamed, his face contorted with fury. "I will sue Phoenix Holdings into the ground. I will take them to court." "That might be difficult," Harrison replied, adjusting his glasses, "considering the chief executive officer and sole owner of Phoenix Holdings is sitting right across from you." Brandon and Naomi snapped their heads toward me simultaneously. The color drained from Brandon's face as the realization hit him like a freight train. Naomi clutched her designer handbag, her eyes wide with shock. "You," Naomi whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at my tailored navy coat. "Me," I said, my voice smooth and lethal. I slid a single paper across the polished table to Brandon. That is a formal eviction notice for trespassing on private corporate property. You and your wife have exactly 2 hours to remove your belongings from my house before the police physically drag you out. You cannot do this to us, Naomi shrieked, jumping up and pointing a manicured finger at me. She turned to the relatives sitting behind them, trying to regain control. Do not listen to her. She stole Catherine's vintage jewelry after the funeral. She drained the bank accounts. Everyone saw my Facebook post. Everyone knows she is a thief. We even had to set up a fundraising campaign to pay for the burial. I did not blink. I reached into my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out the printed receipt from the luxury consignment dealer in Buckhead. I tossed it onto the table. It slid to a stop in front of Aunt Beatrice. No, Naomi, you did, I stated loudly, making sure everyone heard me. 3 days before the funeral, you took my mother's vintage pearl necklaces to a pawn shop. You sold them for $12,000 in cash. You signed that receipt on the table. Police have already recovered the pearls from the dealer. You are facing grand larceny charges. The relatives began to murmur in absolute horror. Aunt Beatrice picked up the receipt, her hands shaking as she recognized Naomi's signature. Cousin Greg looked at Brandon, his face twisting in disgust. You lied to us, Greg said, his voice rising in anger. You told us Cassidy took the money. That fundraising campaign was nothing but a fraudulent cash grab, I explained. I traced the internet protocol addresses and routing numbers from that viral post Naomi created. The money you donated did not go to a funeral home. It was routed directly into an offshore cryptocurrency wallet registered under Naomi's maiden name. She used your sympathy to buy those designer stilettos. Naomi took a frantic step backward, her back hitting the glass wall. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling uncontrollably. This is defamation, Naomi yelled, opening her social media apps. I am going live right now. I will tell the world how you manipulated your parents. I will start another campaign to fight this legal abuse. They will fund our legal defense. She desperately clung to her modern gaslighting tactics, believing public sympathy could somehow overwrite hard financial evidence. She tapped her screen, but her face dropped. Her social media accounts had been suspended. The fundraising platform had frozen the campaign due to fraudulent activity reports I filed earlier that morning. Her echo chamber was gone. You are a monster, Cassidy. Brandon roared, completely ignoring his wife's panic. He lunged forward across the table, knocking over a glass of water. Before he could reach me, the heavy doors of the conference room swung open with incredible force. 2 tall men wearing dark suits and federal badges clipped to their belts stepped into the room. Right behind them were 2 uniformed Atlanta police officers. The room fell into a stunned silence. Brandon, the lead federal agent, said, his voice echoing in the tense space. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and operating an illegal financial scheme. Put your hands behind your back. Pandemonium broke out instantly. Aunt Beatrice and Cousin Greg jumped out of their seats, screaming at Brandon. What scheme? Greg shouted. What about our retirement money? Where is our money, Brandon? Brandon was violently yanked backward. His arms were forced behind his back as the cold steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terror that was profoundly satisfying. He finally understood I had exposed everything. He had leveraged a second mortgage on a house he did not own and stolen millions from our relatives. Cassidy, please. Brandon begged, his arrogant facade completely shattered. Tell them. Help me. You are my sister. I stood up slowly, buttoning my navy coat. I looked down at the man who had tormented me for my entire life, the golden child who had thrown my belongings into the rain just days ago. I felt absolutely nothing for him. Like you said, Brandon, I replied, my voice perfectly calm. Enjoy the streets. As the agents dragged a sobbing Brandon out of the room, I watched Naomi frantically trying to slip her diamond wedding ring off her finger. She was attempting to distance herself from the sinking ship, calculating how much cash she could get for the ring before authorities seized her assets too. The relatives who had cursed my name 48 hours ago were crowding around the federal agents, begging for answers about their stolen life savings. I calmly picked up my briefcase, walked out of the conference room, and stepped into the elevator. When I walked out of the grand lobby and into the bright Atlanta afternoon, the air felt incredibly clean. I had lost my parents, but I had finally excised the toxic cancer that had infected my family. I got into my car, instructed the driver to take me home, and for the first time in 33 years, I was completely free. The silence in the back seat was deafening, a sharp contrast to the digital war zone my life had been just a few days prior. Leaning my head against the cool leather seat, I closed my eyes and allowed my mind to drift back to the morning immediately following my eviction. That was the moment the true scope of their cruelty had materialized. That was the morning the relatives attacked, and my digital isolation reached its absolute peak. I had been sitting at the marble island of my penthouse holding a mug of black coffee, watching my phone vibrate across the countertop. It was a relentless mechanical buzzing that sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. Naomi had dropped her fabricated social media post, claiming I stole my mother's vintage jewelry and drained the emergency bank accounts. She had successfully detonated a bomb in the center of our extended family. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. I reached out and unlocked my screen. A waterfall of toxic text messages flooded my notifications. People I shared blood with, people who had known me since I was a child, were lining up to throw stones. Aunt Beatrice was the first to strike. She had always been the loudest voice in any family gathering, thriving on drama and manufactured outrage. Her message was a masterclass in vitriol. She called me a heartless monster. She demanded to know how I could sleep at night, knowing I had robbed my own dead parents. "You have always been the ugly duckling of this family," her text read. "Brandon is a saint for dealing with your psychotic behavior. Do not ever attempt to contact me or your uncle again. You are entirely dead to us." The sheer venom in her words took my breath away. I swiped to the next message. It was from cousin Greg. Greg had always worshipped Brandon, treating my brother like a financial god because Brandon let him drive his leased sports cars. Greg did not just hurl insults, he sent direct threats. "Brandon told me exactly what you did," Greg typed, using all capital letters to emphasize his rage. "You better return every single cent you took from those accounts, or I am coming to find you myself. You think you can steal from the family and hide. You are a pathetic, useless dropout. We are going to make sure you pay for this." Message after message poured in. Uncle Richard sent a long, condescending paragraph expressing his profound disappointment. He praised Brandon for covering the funeral expenses out of his own pocket, unaware that Brandon was paying for nothing. Uncle Richard called me a disgrace to the family name. He told me I was a selfish parasite who had finally shown her true colors. Distant cousins I had not seen in a decade chimed in with cruel emojis and demands that I surrender myself to the police. The digital isolation was suffocating. I sat alone in my massive, quiet penthouse, staring at a device that was actively radiating hatred. The grief of losing my mother and father collided violently with the realization that I had lost my entire extended family as well. I was completely and utterly alone in the world. Brandon and Naomi had successfully severed every single tie I had to my past. They had painted me as a criminal, and my family eagerly bought the canvas without ever asking for my side of the story. A heavy, crushing weight settled squarely on my chest. For a fraction of a second, the wounded inner child inside me wanted to scream. I wanted to type frantic replies defending my innocence, pleading with them to understand that Brandon was the true monster. I wanted to explain that I had secretly saved the family estate, that I was a senior forensic accountant, that I had never touched her jewelry. But my fingers froze over the keyboard. I stared at the flashing screen, watching another hateful message pop up from a second cousin, and then something fundamental shifted inside my brain. The urge to defend myself evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. These people did not want the truth. They wanted a villain. They wanted someone to look down upon so they could feel better about their own miserable lives. Brandon had flaunted his fake wealth, buying their loyalty with expensive dinners and promises of high investment returns. He had purchased their trust with the very money he was stealing from them. To them, Brandon was the successful golden boy, and I was the easy target. Naomi had simply provided the spark, and the entire family eagerly fanned the flames. I realized that answering their toxic messages would only feed their twisted sense of righteousness. Every tear I shed over their cruelty was a waste of hydration. I took a deep breath, pushing the grief aside, and allowed my professional training to take over. I was no longer the grieving daughter or the rejected sister. I was an investigator, and I was holding a device full of evidence. I began taking screenshots of every single threat and every malicious accusation. I backed up the entire text history to a secure cloud server. Cousin Greg's aggressive threats were documented. Aunt Beatrice's libelous statements were saved. I cataloged their hatred, methodically organizing the screenshots into a dedicated file. This was no longer just family drama. This was a coordinated campaign of harassment and defamation. The digital isolation that was designed to break me had instead set me completely free. By cutting me off, they had inadvertently removed any lingering sense of loyalty or guilt I might have felt toward them. They handed me the absolute freedom to destroy them without a single ounce of mercy. I set my phone down. The past was dead. The future belonged to me. I pushed away from the marble kitchen island, leaving my now cold coffee untouched. My bare feet moved silently across the heated Brazilian walnut floors of my penthouse. The morning sun was finally breaking through the dense Atlanta rain clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the minimalist furniture. Brandon and Naomi had thrown my cheap decoy suitcase into the mud, genuinely believing they had stripped me of my only shelter. They thought I was a pathetic clerk scrambling to find a budget motel on the outskirts of the city. I smiled grimly at the profound irony. I walked down the wide hallway toward the reinforced steel door at the end of the corridor. This was the nerve center of my true existence. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner next to the handle. A soft chime echoed, and the heavy door unsealed with a satisfying mechanical click. I stepped into my private home office. It looked less like an accounting firm and more like a cybersecurity command center. 4 massive curved monitors dominated the sleek black glass desk in the center of the room. A dedicated server rack hummed quietly in the corner, cooling the encrypted drives that held the financial secrets of some of the most powerful corporations in the country. This was where the ugly college dropout lived. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and woke the system from its sleep mode. The screens flared to life, illuminating the darkened room with lines of complex code and secure login portals. I bypassed the standard commercial firewalls and launched my proprietary forensic accounting suite. It was a highly specialized piece of software I had developed alongside elite cybersecurity experts. As the loading bars filled the screens, I allowed myself a brief moment to reflect on the false narrative my family had clung to for so long. They loved telling their country club friends that I had failed out of university because I could not handle the academic pressure. The truth was far more calculated. I had not dropped out. I had quietly transferred my credits to an accelerated, highly specialized program focused strictly on forensic finance and white-collar crime. I realized early on that tracking hidden assets and exposing corporate fraud was infinitely more lucrative than balancing basic ledgers. While Brandon was taking out predatory loans to lease European sports cars and buy expensive suits to impress our parents, I was securing massive, highly confidential contracts with federal agencies and multinational conglomerates. My wealth was not built on loud, flashy investments or aggressive social media boasting. It was built in absolute silence. I audited corrupt executives, traced offshore shell companies, and untangled complex webs of financial deceit. My clients paid me exorbitant 8-figure consulting fees precisely because I operated like a ghost. I had no public profile, no flashy networking pages, and no desire for applause. The digital isolation my family forced upon me had actually been my greatest professional advantage. They had practically handed me the perfect cover story. I was just the quiet, struggling sister who worked a mediocre desk job. They never bothered to look past my plain clothes or my quiet demeanor. Now I was going to use those exact forensic skills to dismantle their entire fabricated reality. I pulled up a blank digital canvas across my primary monitors. and began building the target profiles. I started with my older brother. I typed in his full legal name, his date of birth, and his full social security number, which I had memorized years ago from a family tax document. Then I carefully added his wife. Naomi was a fascinating subject for a financial audit. For someone who claimed to be independently wealthy and superior to everyone else, she possessed incredibly sloppy digital hygiene. She checked into every expensive restaurant, tagged her location at luxury boutiques, and relentlessly posted photographs of designer items she had supposedly purchased. In the world of forensic accounting, a loud ego is always a massive liability. I linked her public social media profiles to my software and let the algorithms begin cross-referencing her posted locations with local financial transaction registries. Next, I input the names of the various limited liability companies Brandon had bragged about running. He called himself a director of investments, throwing around buzzwords like diversified portfolios and aggressive market yields. I initiated a deep web scan of those specific corporate entities, commanding the software to pull their public tax filings and corporation dates and registered operating addresses. The servers hummed louder as the system began parsing through millions of data points, scraping public records and matching them against private banking registries. I watched progress bars advance across the multiple screens, my heart rate perfectly steady and completely controlled. The emotional turmoil of being violently evicted from my childhood home had completely vanished, replaced entirely by the cold, surgical precision of my chosen profession. Numbers simply do not lie. They do not gaslight you. They do not play favorites with the golden child. And they certainly do not care about blind family loyalty. They only tell the absolute, undeniable truth. As the very first wave of encrypted financial data began to populate my high-definition monitors, I immediately noticed several glaring structural anomalies. The preliminary numbers simply did not align with the incredibly lavish lifestyle Brandon and Naomi loudly projected to the world. There were massive unexplained gaps in corporate revenue, highly bizarre offshore transfers, and a staggering lack of actual liquid assets in his primary business accounts. The underlying foundation of his entire existence was structurally unsound and ready to collapse. I leaned forward in my chair, my eyes narrowing sharply at a highly specific string of outgoing wire transfers directly linked to Naomi's digital footprint. The software flagged a deeply suspicious local retail transaction that occurred just days prior. I grabbed my mouse and prepared to dive directly into the specific internet protocol addresses and digital receipts. The hunt had officially begun. I focused my attention on the primary screen where Naomi's digital footprint was laid out like a glowing web. The social media post she had used to crucify me earlier that morning was still gaining traction. Relatives were actively sharing the link to the fundraising campaign, leaving comments filled with false pity and vitriol aimed at me. I isolated the web address of the campaign and ran a deep trace on the originating internet protocol address. It took less than a minute for the software to bypass the basic encryption of the fundraising platform. The campaign was not registered to a funeral home, an estate account, or even a legitimate memorial trust. It was tied directly to a private routing number. I initiated a secondary protocol to follow the money trail. The routing number bounced through a proxy server before landing squarely in a cryptocurrency exchange wallet. The registered owner of that specific wallet was Naomi, using her maiden name to mask the asset stream. She was siphoning the grief of our extended family directly into her personal offshore accounts. Financial fraud on a crowdsourcing platform was highly illegal, but it was just a misdemeanor in the grand scheme of things. I wanted a major felony. I wanted something that would shatter their untouchable image into a million irreparable pieces. I shifted my focus to the anomaly my system had flagged moments earlier. Naomi possessed an obsessive need to document her luxurious life online. Every brunch, every shopping trip, every spa day was meticulously logged with geolocation tags. I synchronized her social media location data with her recent financial transactions. The timeline of her movements over the past week populated on my screen. My parents had passed away on Monday evening. The funeral was held on Friday. I traced Naomi's location data for Tuesday, the morning immediately following the fatal car crash. While Brandon was supposedly making tragic phone calls to the family, Naomi's phone pinged at a highly exclusive commercial address in the wealthy Buckhead district. It was not a boutique or a high-end restaurant. It was a luxury consignment dealer, an upscale pawn shop known for handling high-value estate liquidations discreetly. My pulse quickened. Naomi had accused me of stealing my mother's vintage pearl necklaces immediately after the funeral. She used that specific accusation to turn the entire family against me and justify my violent eviction. I opened a secure backdoor into the regional property transaction database. Pawn shops and high-end consignment dealers are legally required to log significant cash purchases and inventory acquisitions to prevent the fencing of stolen goods. I filtered the database for transactions occurring at that specific Buckhead address on Tuesday morning. The query returned 12 results. I refined the search parameters, isolating transactions over $10,000. The list narrowed to a single entry. I clicked on the file and a digitized copy of a sales receipt filled my center monitor. The ink was clear and the details were perfectly legible. The item description read one complete set of vintage pearl necklaces, excellent condition. The payout amount was listed as $12,000 distributed entirely in cash. And there at the very bottom of the document, resting right on the signature line, was Naomi's unmistakable looping handwriting. She had provided her own state identification to process the sale. The transaction was time-stamped at 10 in the morning on Tuesday. I sat back in my leather chair, letting the magnitude of this discovery wash over me. 3 full days before my parents were even laid to rest, while their bodies were still at the county medical examiner's office, my sister-in-law had walked into my childhood home. She had bypassed the mourning process entirely, walked straight into my dead mother's bedroom and looted her jewelry box. She had stolen the exact pearls she later accused me of taking. She had fenced stolen estate property for $12,000 in raw cash. The sheer, unadulterated depravity of her actions was almost difficult to comprehend. She had not just framed me for theft. She had orchestrated the crime herself, used the proceeds to fund her extravagant lifestyle, and then weaponized the resulting fake narrative to evict me. I thought back to the moment she stood in my bedroom sneering down at me. She had been wearing a brand new pair of designer stilettos, the kind that cost thousands of dollars. She had literally used the cash from my dead mother's stolen pearls to buy the shoes she wore to kick me out into the rain. I felt a cold, sharp smile form on my face. The fury I felt was no longer wild or uncontrollable. It had hardened into a precise, tactical weapon. I saved the digitized receipt, downloading multiple encrypted copies to my secure local servers. I captured the geolocation data, the timestamp, and the matching signature analysis. This single document was a direct ticket to a grand larceny charge. It proved premeditated theft from a deceased estate fraud and filing false police reports. Naomi thought she was a criminal mastermind because she knew how to manipulate a group chat of gullible relatives. She thought shedding a few fake tears on the internet gave her absolute power over my life. She was playing a dangerous game, completely unaware that I had just flipped the entire board. I took the pawnshop receipt and the cryptocurrency wallet data, merging them into a legal folder on my desktop. I was not going to show this to the family yet. I was going to hand it directly to my lawyer to ensure the criminal charges were drafted before she even knew what hit her. She wanted to play the grieving victim for sympathy. I was going to make sure she played the convicted felon in front of a federal judge. I closed the window and leaned back, ready to strike. The financial trap was set, and there was absolutely no escape for them now. With Naomi's criminal pawning securely documented, I minimized her digital file and turned my attention to the main event. Brandon. For as long as I could remember, my older brother had been the untouchable golden child. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove heavily leased European sports cars, and tossed around complex financial jargon to make everyone else feel incredibly uneducated. He branded himself as a managing director of investments. He had successfully convinced our parents and extended family that he was a Wall Street-caliber financial genius. Now it was time to tear down his curated facade brick by brick. I launched a new instance of my forensic auditing suite across my center monitors. I typed in Brandon's full legal name, his social security number, and the employer identification numbers associated with his holding companies. My software bypassed the superficial corporate registries and dug straight into the secure banking infrastructure. The screens rapidly filled with scrolling lines of encrypted data processing the corporate tax returns and bank statements he had filed over the last 5 years. I watched the progress bar inch forward, my anticipation growing with every passing second. I knew he was hiding something. The initial financial summary populated on my left monitor. On paper, Brandon managed a boutique hedge fund, catering exclusively to high-net-worth individuals. The public website for his firm was highly polished, featuring premium stock photos and charts displaying upward trending profit margins. He publicly claimed to have over $50 million in active assets under management. However, when my specialized software scraped the verified balances of his registered corporate banking accounts, the numbers told a shockingly different story. The accounts were practically empty. I furrowed my brow, leaning closer to the screen, and initiated a deep trace on his outgoing wire transfers. If the money was not sitting in his primary accounts, it had to be somewhere else. The software rapidly decrypted a massive web of complex international transactions. Brandon was utilizing anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware and Wyoming to funnel money out of his primary domestic accounts. From there, the funds were being systematically wired to unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. He was not investing in stable mutual funds. He was gambling wildly with other people's money. I forced a secure backdoor open into the transactional ledgers for his offshore accounts. The raw data revealed a catastrophic financial timeline. Exactly 2 years ago, right around the time he bought his latest luxury car and upgraded to an exclusive country club membership, Brandon had heavily leveraged his entire investment portfolio on a series of highly volatile alternative cryptocurrency coins. The market had subsequently crashed, wiping out nearly his entire leveraged position overnight. I ran the exact calculation using my auditing tools. Brandon had lost exactly $4 million in a matter of weeks. He was completely broke. But how was he still operating his firm? How was he paying for Naomi's designer wardrobe and his expensive glass-walled office space downtown? I switched my focus to my right monitor and pulled up his domestic incoming transfer logs. The forensic software automatically color-coded the deposits by origin, making the financial pattern instantly recognizable. A cold, sharp realization washed over me. I was looking at a massive textbook, completely undisguised Ponzi scheme. Brandon was actively soliciting fresh investments from our extended family and their affluent social circle. I saw a cleared wire transfer from Aunt Beatrice for $75,000, labeled explicitly as a retirement investment. I saw a direct deposit from Cousin Greg for $50,000. There were dozens of similar high-value transactions from the exact same people who had attended my parents' funeral and subsequently attacked me on social media. They were handing Brandon their entire life savings, blindly trusting him to grow their wealth. Instead of actually investing their hard-earned money, Brandon was immediately shifting those new incoming funds to pay fake dividend returns to his older investors. This created the absolute illusion that his boutique fund was highly profitable and reliable. The rest of the incoming cash was being aggressively siphoned off into his personal checking accounts to cover his massive personal expenses and service the minimum interest payments on his crippling offshore crypto debt. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul and using the excess capital to buy tailored suits. The sheer scale of his financial fraud was absolutely breathtaking. He had weaponized our parents' pristine reputation in the local community to build immediate, unquestioning trust with these victims. My family was violently defending the exact man who was systematically destroying their financial futures. They boldly called me a thief over a fake manipulated social media post, while the man they praised as an absolute saint was actively stealing their retirement funds right under their noses. The painful irony of their blind loyalty was so sharp it almost felt physical. I meticulously documented every single fraudulent wire transfer. I captured high-resolution screenshots of the incoming deposits from Aunt Beatrice and Cousin Greg, tracing the exact routing path those specific funds took before landing securely in Brandon's personal checking account to fund his lavish lifestyle. I saved the digital ledgers from the offshore cryptocurrency exchanges, completely exposing his massive $4 million deficit. My specialized forensic software perfectly compiled the entire dataset into a comprehensive, irrefutable audit trail that no defense attorney could ever possibly deny. Brandon had built a fragile house of cards, and he was absolutely desperate to keep it from collapsing. That intense desperation explained everything about his cruel behavior. It perfectly explained why he was so eager to violently kick me out of my childhood home immediately after the funeral. He desperately needed to liquidate my parents' entire estate as fast as possible to inject fresh capital into his failing Ponzi scheme. He honestly thought grabbing their remaining assets would give him enough financial runway to survive another few months without getting caught by the federal authorities. I stared at the glowing monitors, my expression hardening into pure, unyielding ice. He had severely underestimated the wrong sister. He truly thought his financial crimes were safely hidden behind confusing corporate jargon and untraceable offshore proxies. He did not realize that I unraveled complex financial fraud for a living, and I was the best in the business. I selected the compiled audit file and encrypted it with a military-grade cipher. This was the exact ammunition I needed to ensure he would never hurt anyone else again. His golden child persona was without a single doubt about to be completely obliterated. I needed to understand exactly how the golden boy managed to lose $4 million without a single person noticing the massive financial hemorrhage. I opened a secondary terminal on my left monitor and initiated a direct tracking sequence on the specific offshore wallet addresses. Brandon had always been arrogant, but financial stupidity of this magnitude required a special level of reckless ego. My software began pulling the historical trade logs from the unregulated overseas exchanges. The raw data painted a pathetic picture of a man desperately chasing the illusion of his own manufactured financial brilliance and absolute market superiority. 2 years ago, during the peak of the digital currency boom, Brandon had moved all the legitimate investment capital he had collected from our relatives into highly volatile margin accounts. He was not just buying alternative coins. He was actively borrowing against the family's initial investments to multiply his trading power. It was the financial equivalent of betting your entire life savings on a single spin of a roulette wheel. When the market inevitably experienced a massive correction, his highly leveraged positions were immediately targeted for automatic liquidation by the exchange algorithms. The brutal margin calls hit his accounts fast. I watched the digital timeline unfold across my screens like a slow-motion train wreck. To prevent the trading platforms from seizing his remaining assets, Brandon was legally forced to inject massive amounts of fresh liquid cash into his accounts. That was the exact moment his legitimate, albeit poorly managed investment firm officially transitioned into a desperate criminal enterprise. I pulled up his digital calendar and cross-referenced his scheduled appointments with the dates of his incoming wire transfers. The correlation was absolutely sickening. He had explicitly targeted the most vulnerable members of our extended family for immediate financial exploitation. There was a calendar entry labeled Thanksgiving Dinner Pitch, followed 3 days later by a massive deposit from Uncle Richard. There was a Christmas holiday strategy session that perfectly coincided with the $75,000 wire transfer from Aunt Beatrice. He was specifically preying on the elderly relatives, the ones who trusted him completely and lacked the technical literacy to verify his fabricated investment reports. He sat at our holiday tables eating turkey and drinking expensive wine while aggressively talking his own family members into handing over their retirement safety nets to cover his hidden criminal gambling debts indefinitely. I ran a predictive burn rate analysis using his current financial liabilities. The numbers were staggering. Because of the aggressive compounding interest on his offshore margin loans, Brandon required a minimum of $50,000 a month just to keep the accounts from defaulting. He was bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate. The Ponzi scheme was a ticking time bomb, and based on my calculations, the timer had reached zero exactly 2 weeks ago. I isolated his primary domestic checking account and stared at the remaining balance. He had less than $400 left to his professional business name. He was completely destitute. The realization made me sick to my stomach. This was the man who had just sneered at me and called me a homeless dropout. He was currently living entirely on the stolen charity funds Naomi had crowdsourced using our parents' tragic death. I needed to see exactly how desperate he had become right before the car accident. I deployed a specialized phishing protocol to access the sent folder of his primary business email account. I filtered the search results for the 30 days leading up to the fatal crash. A flagged email appeared on screen immediately. The message was timestamped exactly 1 week before my parents died. It was addressed to a private high-interest lending firm known for dealing with high-risk clients. I opened the encrypted text and read Brandon's desperate plea. He was begging the firm for a short-term bridge loan of $500,000. He explicitly promised the lender that he would have guaranteed real estate collateral to back the loan within 30 days. I read that specific sentence 4 times, feeling a deep, unsettling chill radiate through my entire body. Guaranteed real estate collateral secured entirely within 30 days. Brandon did not own any significant real estate outright. His own luxury suburban home was heavily mortgaged and his sports cars were all leased. He had absolutely zero physical assets to offer a predatory lending firm. There was only one piece of prime real estate in our entire family that held enough equity to secure a $500,000 bridge loan. My childhood home. The very same home he had violently kicked me out of yesterday. He had been planning to leverage our parents' estate to save himself from total financial ruin. But how could he ever legally guarantee it? Our parents were in perfect health a week before the accident. They had no intention of selling the house or handing the property over to him. Brandon was arrogant, but he could not predict a fatal car crash. This meant he had actively taken steps to secure control over their assets while they were still breathing. The fraudulent power of attorney document he shoved in my face suddenly took on a much darker, far more sinister context. It was not just a tool to evict me. It was the absolute linchpin of a premeditated plan to steal home equity funds. He needed them to sign away their financial autonomy. I quickly downloaded the email to the private lender and added it to the master audit file I was compiling for the federal authorities. The evidence of his financial crimes was now completely airtight. I had the fraudulent wire transfers, the offshore debt ledgers, the fake profit statements sent to the relatives, and the desperate written admission of his intent to leverage family real estate to cover his tracks. The $4 million crypto deficit was the motive, and the Ponzi scheme was his undeniable method of complete total personal destruction. I locked my primary workstation and transferred the encrypted files to a secure portable flash drive. It was time to bring this digital evidence into the physical world. I grabbed my tailored coat and took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage. The drive to the financial district was quick, the Atlanta traffic parting easily under the sun. I pulled into the parking structure of a glass building that housed the most elite legal minds in the state. Harrison was a senior partner at the firm, a man who had guided my parents through their business endeavors for decades, and who now handled my highly confidential corporate entities. I walked through the marble lobby, my heels echoing against the polished floor. The receptionist greeted me and buzzed me through the glass doors. Harrison was waiting in his corner office, standing by a massive mahogany desk covered in organized legal files. He was a sharp man in his late 60s, wearing a bespoke suit that projected absolute authority. He took one look at my face and knew this was not a standard condolence meeting. I handed him the secure drive and sat down in the leather chair across from him. Cassidy Harrison began, his tone gentle but deeply professional. I am profoundly sorry for your loss. I was shocked when I heard the news about Thomas and Catherine. Thank you, Harrison, I replied, keeping my voice steady. But we do not have time for grief right now. Brandon kicked me out of the house yesterday. He had 2 large men physically throw my belongings into the muddy driveway while it was pouring rain. He claimed he is the sole executor of the estate, and holds a signed power of attorney for all financial assets. Harrison frowned, the sympathetic warmth leaving his eyes replaced instantly by sharp legal calculation. He sat and adjusted his reading glasses. That is impossible, Cassidy. I hold your parents' master file right here in my desk drawer. They never updated their directives, and they certainly never appointed Brandon as the sole executor. I opened my laptop on his desk and connected the secure drive. He shoved a document in my face. I explained. Pulling up a digital replica, I mentally reconstructed based on my brief glance at the paperwork during the eviction. The signatures looked somewhat accurate, but the notary stamp and the execution date felt entirely wrong. I need you to verify exactly what he is holding. Harrison opened the physical master file on his desk, pulling out the original verified documents my parents had signed years ago. He placed them side by side with the digital notes I had provided. He pulled a magnifying glass from his top drawer and leaned over the desk, scrutinizing the legal formatting, the specific phrasing of the clauses, and the exact placement of the notary seal. The silence in the sprawling office was incredibly thick, broken only by the quiet sound of paper shuffling. "This is a complete and total forgery," Harrison announced, finally his voice dropping to a low, furious whisper. "It is not even a sophisticated fake. Look at this notary seal right here." He pointed a silver pen at the illuminated screen. The commission expiration date listed on this specific stamp is from 4 years ago. A legitimate notary public would never use an expired seal on a legal document of this magnitude. Furthermore, the boilerplate language used in this text is pulled directly from a generic online template. It completely lacks the specific state-mandated clauses required for a valid Georgia power of attorney. I leaned back in my chair, processing the absolute confirmation of my suspicions. He fabricated the document to force me out and seize control of the physical property before the actual will reading, I said. He is desperate for cash. I traced his accounts this morning. He is running a massive Ponzi scheme using our relatives' retirement funds, and he is currently $4 million in debt to offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. Harrison stared at me, his professional composure cracking for a fraction of a second. A Ponzi scheme. He is actively stealing from your family members. Yes, I confirmed coldly. And Naomi took my mother's vintage pearls to a consignment shop in Buckhead 3 days before the funeral. They are liquidating the estate piece by piece. Brandon thinks he can use this fake power of attorney to bypass the probate court and drain whatever liquid cash Mom and Dad had left. Harrison shook his head in absolute disgust. Forging a legal document to seize an estate is a severe felony. Using an expired notary seal is another distinct criminal charge. He is looking at years in federal prison just for this single piece of paper. But Cassidy, there is a fundamental flaw in his plan that he is entirely missing. Even if this forged document were perfectly executed, a power of attorney instantly expires the absolute second the principal party dies. It grants him zero legal authority over a deceased estate. He cannot use this to sell the house or access their bank accounts post-mortem. I nodded, understanding the legal mechanism perfectly. He does not know that. He thinks possessing this piece of paper makes him the undisputed king of the castle. He believes he can leverage the property immediately to secure a $500,000 bridge loan from a predatory lending firm. I found the emails he sent. He explicitly guaranteed them real estate collateral within 30 days. Harrison froze, his pen hovering above his legal pad. The air in the room suddenly grew incredibly tense. He looked down at the master file, then back up at me, his eyes widening with a sudden, horrifying realization. Cassidy, Harrison said, his voice unusually tight. Brandon did not just forge a power of attorney to kick you out. I watched as Harrison pulled a secondary red-tabbed folder from the locked bottom drawer of his massive desk. His hands were moving with a frantic urgency I had never witnessed in all my years of working closely with him. He opened the folder and pushed a heavy stack of freshly printed financial records across the polished mahogany table. My eyes immediately locked onto the bold heading at the top of the first page. It was a formal deed of trust attached to a highly aggressive promissory note. I am looking at a secondary property lien that was officially filed with the county clerk just 4 weeks ago, Harrison explained, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He slid his pen down to the bottom of the page, pointing directly at the signature lines. Brandon coerced your parents into signing a second mortgage on the family estate to bail out his failing investment fund. He executed this massive loan just weeks before they died in that horrific car crash. He extracted exactly $500,000 in home equity. My vision tunneled completely. I picked up the promissory note, my forensic accounting training taking over as I rapidly scanned the fine print and the attached disbursement records. Brandon had not just kicked me out into the freezing rain. He had actively and maliciously bled our parents dry while they were still breathing. He had forced them to mortgage their false sense of security to cover his immense criminal gambling debts. A cold and lethal fury settled deep in my chest. I looked at the signatures on the loan agreement. The penmanship looked authentic at first glance, but the spacing was entirely wrong. They did not sign this document willingly, I stated, analyzing the digital artifact on the page. Look at the baseline of my father's signature. The pressure is completely uniform, which never happens with natural handwriting. Brandon lifted these signatures from a previous tax document and digitally superimposed them onto this fraudulent loan application. Harrison leaned closer, inspecting the document with his magnifying glass. You are absolutely right, Cassidy. The ink saturation does not match the paper grain. But it gets significantly worse. Look at the lender information. Brandon did not go to a traditional bank for this equity extraction. He used a private, high-risk shadow lending firm. Traditional banks require strict title insurance and mandatory in-person appraisals. This predatory firm completely bypassed standard regulatory checks because Brandon guaranteed them an exorbitant interest rate. He promised them immediate returns using the physical property as absolute collateral. I opened my laptop and rapidly typed the name of the shadow lending firm into my tracking software. Within seconds, the routing data confirmed my absolute worst fears. The $500,000 payout was wired directly into the same offshore cryptocurrency exchange wallet that Brandon used to fund his massive $4 million deficit. He had literally stolen $500,000 in phantom equity to buy himself exactly one more month of financial survival. But there is a massive fatal flaw in his entire master plan, I said, looking up at Harrison with a razor-sharp smile. Brandon committed extreme federal bank fraud by leveraging a property that my parents did not even legally own. Harrison let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. Exactly. 3 years ago, when Brandon nearly bankrupted your parents the first time with his failed day trading, they were 90 days away from total foreclosure. He has absolutely no idea that you stepped in to save them. I looked out the window at the glittering Atlanta skyline. No, he does not. The drop-feed reality of my family's financial situation was a masterclass in profound irony. 3 years ago, my parents had come to me in absolute tears. Brandon had completely lost their retirement funds. To save them from losing the family home to the bank, I had quietly established an anonymous corporate entity called Phoenix Holdings. Through that specific limited liability company, I paid off their entire underwater mortgage in full, legally purchasing the estate in cash. For the last 3 years, my parents had not owned that house at all. They were legally renting it from my private company for exactly $1 a month. Brandon had forged a fake power of attorney to steal a house that already belonged entirely to me. The second mortgage he had fraudulently forced through the shadow lender just weeks before their death was completely void because my parents did not hold the deed to the property. He had committed federal wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud against a property owned by my corporate entity. This completely shifts the legal battlefield, Harrison noted, his legal mind rapidly assembling the prosecution strategy. Brandon is not just facing state-level forgery charges for the fake eviction notice. By securing a loan across state lines using digitally altered signatures against a corporate asset, he triggered automatic federal jurisdiction. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will absolutely dismantle his entire life. Let him play his hand, I told Harrison, my voice turning to absolute ice. Schedule the official will reading for this Friday at noon. Tell Brandon he is legally required to attend with his wife and the whole extended family to formally transfer the estate assets. Make it sound like a mandatory victory lap for him. He is going to walk into this conference room thinking he owns the entire world, Harrison warned, sounding deeply concerned for my emotional state amidst this chaotic disaster. I know, I replied, smoothly closing my laptop with a definitive snap. That is exactly what I am counting on. I need his monumental ego to blind him completely. I need him to feel totally invincible right up until the exact second the handcuffs lock around his wrists. The trap was perfectly set, and his horrific second mortgage secret was the final nail. I was completely prepared to watch him lose everything he claimed to own and spend years behind bars. I left Harrison in his office completely prepared to watch him lose everything he claimed to own and spend years behind bars. The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt remarkably peaceful. I had the financial records, the pawn shop receipt, and the proof of his massive federal bank fraud securely stored on my encrypted drives. But my forensic background taught me one absolute rule about prosecuting white-collar criminals. You can never have too much evidence. Document forgery and financial manipulation could sometimes be spun by a highly paid defense attorney as a desperate mistake made under extreme duress. I needed to prove malicious, calculated intent. I needed Brandon to publicly and arrogantly declare his plan to withhold estate assets using that fake power of attorney. To do that, I had to play a role I utterly despised. I had to briefly become the helpless, pathetic victim he always believed me to be. Returning to my penthouse, I settled onto my velvet sofa and unlocked my smartphone. The family group chat was still a highly active toxic war zone, my screen illuminated with a continuous stream of vile notifications. Aunt Beatrice was aggressively posting links to Naomi's fake fundraising campaign, urging all the extended relatives to open their wallets to support poor Brandon during this tragic time. Cousin Greg was actively hyping up Brandon's supposed financial brilliance, suggesting that Brandon should permanently manage the parents' remaining estate funds because I would probably just waste them on a useless art degree. The sheer delusion was almost laughable. They were practically begging the wolf to guard the sheep, eagerly handing over their money to a man drowning in a $4 million cryptocurrency deficit. I took a deep breath, suppressing my profound disgust, and tapped the text input field. Manipulating a raging narcissist requires a very specific, carefully calibrated approach. You cannot challenge them directly. You have to feed their ego, validate their perceived superiority, and offer them a captive audience for their cruelty. I crafted a message specifically designed to make Brandon feel like an absolute god of finance looking down on a worthless peasant. Brandon, please. I typed, making sure my grammar seemed slightly frantic and terrified. I am so sorry to bother everyone here. I do not have anywhere to go tonight. The motels around the city are too expensive and I'm genuinely scared out of my mind. I know we have our differences, but can you please just give me a very small fraction of Mom and Dad's savings? Just enough to make rent for a cheap room this month. I promise I will pay you back when I find a new job. I hit send and waited. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. I was not a scared little girl anymore. I was a highly trained financial investigator watching a target circle the bait. The chat fell completely silent for exactly 3 minutes. The influx of toxic comments from the extended relatives halted abruptly. They were all holding their breath, waiting to see how the golden child would handle the family failure. I watched the typing indicator bubble pop up next to Brandon's name, disappear, and then pop up again. He was carefully crafting his response, ensuring it delivered maximum humiliation for his eagerly watching audience. His reply finally materialized on my screen, and it was better than I could have ever hoped for. Enjoy the streets, you ugly college dropout loser. Mom and Dad knew you were a complete failure, which is exactly why they put me in charge. I hold their signed power of attorney, and I am the sole executor of this estate now. I control every single bank account, and I am keeping every single red cent. You get absolutely nothing. Do not even bother showing up to the will reading on Friday because you are officially cut off. Naomi immediately chimed in right beneath his message, completely unable to let her husband take all the glory. Do not beg my husband for money, you parasite. You already stole Catherine's jewelry. We are giving all the estate funds to Brandon's investment firm where it belongs. Get a job and stop leeching off successful people." Aunt Beatrice reacted to Naomi's message with a giant heart emoji. Cousin Greg replied with a laughing face icon. I did not feel a single ounce of pain reading their toxic words. I felt pure, unadulterated triumph. Brandon had just handed me a loaded gun. In a written time-stamped format visible to over 20 witnesses in the group chat, he had explicitly confessed to utilizing the forged power of attorney to seize control of deceased estate assets. He had openly stated his malicious intent to withhold funds. Furthermore, Naomi had publicly admitted their plan to funnel the stolen estate money directly into his fraudulent investment firm, perfectly tying the eviction and the forged documents to his massive Ponzi scheme. I immediately activated my forensic capture tools. I took high-resolution screenshots of the entire exchange, ensuring the timestamp sender identification numbers and read receipts were perfectly preserved. I extracted the metadata from the chat application to prevent any future claims of digital manipulation or hacking. I packaged these files into an encrypted format and forwarded the entire bundle directly to Harrison at the law firm. I got him. I typed in a secure message to my lawyer. Written confession of intent to defraud the estate using the forged power of attorney, plus a clear admission of funneling the assets into his holding company. Add this to the federal packet immediately. Harrison replied less than a minute later. This is a prosecutor's absolute dream, Cassidy. He just tied his own noose. The federal white-collar unit will have a field day with this written admission. I am updating the briefing file now. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. The bait had been taken, swallowed, and fully digested. Brandon firmly believed he had just asserted his absolute dominance over me. He thought he had humiliated me in front of our entire family, solidifying his position as the wealthy, powerful patriarch. He had absolutely no clue that his arrogant text message was the final piece of evidence required to guarantee a maximum federal prison sentence. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the sprawling city. The sky was beautifully clear, the storm from the previous days having completely passed. My preparation was almost complete. I had the financial audit of his $4 million crypto debt. I had the pawn shop receipt proving Naomi's grand larceny. I had the bank records showing his fraudulent second mortgage. Now I had his written confession. There was only one final step left before the execution on Friday. I needed to ensure that the authorities were physically present to witness his downfall. My thoughts were interrupted by the sharp buzz of my phone vibrating against the glass table. I glanced down. It was a direct private message from Brandon. The public humiliation in the family group chat was apparently not enough to satisfy his inflated ego. He needed a private victory lap. Listen closely, Brandon wrote, dropping the performative family man act entirely. I spoke with my legal team. They said that having you lurking around could slow down the probate process with unnecessary nuisance claims. I need the estate assets liquidated by Monday to inject capital into my offshore investment funds. I am offering you a one-time deal. I will wire you $2,000 for rent. In exchange, you will sign a digital waiver completely renouncing your right to contest the will or the power of attorney. I stared at the screen, a genuine smile spreading across my face. He was actively trying to extort me across state lines using a digital communication network. That was another distinct federal charge. I leaned over the table, picked up my phone, and decided to push him just a little bit further into the abyss. Why do you need me to sign anything if your power of attorney is so legally bulletproof? I typed back, injecting the perfect amount of naive hesitation into my response. And why do you need to liquidate Mom and Dad's house so fast? I thought your hedge fund was already worth $50 million. I knew exactly which buttons to press. Questioning a narcissist's financial prowess always yielded a volatile, overcompensating response. The typing indicator flashed wildly on my screen. He was taking the bait hook, line, and sinker. My fund is doing incredibly well, you idiot, Brandon fired back. but high-level offshore crypto investments require massive immediate liquidity to leverage market dips. I already pulled $500,000 out of the house last month. It was incredibly easy to get Mom and Dad to sign the second mortgage paperwork when they were tired and heavily medicated. They had no idea what they were looking at. Now I need to finalize the transfer to secure the rest of the equity. A major private lender is waiting for the clear title. So sign the waiver, take the $2,000, and disappear. My breath caught in my throat. I read the message a second time to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. He had just confessed in writing to coercing our elderly parents into signing fraudulent loan documents while they were medically incapacitated. He had also explicitly confirmed his ongoing negotiations with the predatory shadow lender. He was literally handing me a signed confession to elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and grand theft. I decided to throw one final deadly hook. "What about Mom's vintage pearls?" I texted back. "Naomi told everyone I stole them. But I know you guys took them. Why do you need to pawn her jewelry if you are so rich?" "Because we deserved an immediate advance on our inheritance," Brandon replied without a single second of hesitation. Naomi wanted new shoes for the funeral, and Mom's outdated pearls fetched $12,000 in cash at a shop in Buckhead. It is called taking what is rightfully ours. Now give me your email address so I can send over the digital waiver. If you do not sign it by midnight, I will personally make sure you never get a job in this city again. I have powerful connections. I did not reply. I did not need to. The digital execution was officially complete. I took pristine high-resolution screenshots of the entire private conversation. I captured the timestamps, the incoming routing data, and his explicit threats of extortion and blackmail. I bundled these new images with the previous group chat confessions. I opened my encrypted communication portal and directly messaged Special Agent Vance, the primary contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division, who is currently reviewing my massive audit file. "Agent Vance," I typed securely. "I am uploading a supplementary evidence file now. The target has explicitly confessed to elder financial abuse regarding the second mortgage. He admitted that the principal signers were heavily medicated and unaware of the document's contents. He also confirmed his intent to commit wire fraud by liquidating the estate through a private shadow lender by Monday. Furthermore, he admitted to his wife's grand larceny regarding the stolen jewelry in Buckhead." I uploaded the bundle and watched the encrypted progress bar fill the screen. It took less than 2 minutes for Agent Vance to reply. "Received and verified," the federal agent wrote back. "The coercion admission regarding the second mortgage provides the final threshold for an aggravated identity theft charge. Combined with the offshore Ponzi audit you provided earlier, we have authorized full federal arrest warrants for both Brandon and Naomi. We have coordinated with local law enforcement. Plainclothes agents will be physically present at the law firm building on Friday at noon. We will move in the moment he attempts to present the forged power of attorney to your legal counsel." "Thank you, Agent Vance," I replied. "I will see you on Friday." I closed the encrypted portal and shut down my computer monitors. The glowing screens faded to black, leaving the penthouse office bathed in the soft afternoon sunlight. The sheer magnitude of Brandon's arrogance was almost difficult to comprehend. He truly believed he was the smartest person in any room. He thought he could manipulate the law, exploit his family, and extort his sister without facing a single consequence. He had built an entire existence on a foundation of lies, deception, and stolen money. Now that foundation was completely rigged with federal explosives, and he had personally handed me the detonator. I stood up from my desk and walked out the heavy steel door, locking securely right behind me. I left the penthouse the following morning and drove straight back to the financial district. The air outside was crisp, carrying the distinct energy of a storm that had finally broken. The federal agents were in place, the digital evidence was secured, and the trap was perfectly primed. But before Friday's execution could commence, Harrison and I needed to review the physical documentation that would serve as the absolute kill shot. The corporate veil of Phoenix Holdings had to be flawlessly presented to the probate court. I entered Harrison's office, taking my usual seat across the massive mahogany desk. He already had the thick red tabbed property file open, smoothing out the original deed of trust. He looked up, his expression a mixture of profound professional respect and lingering disbelief at the sheer audacity of my brother's actions. I still cannot fully comprehend the level of delusion required for Brandon to leverage a property. He never bothered to run a basic title search on Harrison, said, tapping his silver pen against the deed. If he had hired a competent real estate attorney instead of relying on a fraudulent shadow lender, he would have instantly discovered that Thomas and Catherine held absolutely zero equity in that estate. I crossed my legs, resting my hands on my leather briefcase. Arrogance breeds extreme laziness, Harrison. Brandon was so accustomed to our parents handing him whatever he demanded that he simply assumed the deed was sitting in their safe, ripe for the taking. He never factored me into his calculations because he spent his entire life viewing me as a financially illiterate failure. He thought he was completely untouchable. Harrison shook his head, flipping to the incorporation documents of my private company. It is a brilliant piece of corporate structuring, Cassidy. Setting up Phoenix Holdings as an anonymous limited liability company in Delaware to purchase the house completely shielded your involvement. But remind me again how exactly this specific arrangement came to be. I know you finalized the purchase 3 years ago, but your parents were fiercely proud people. How did you convince them to surrender the deed to a corporate entity? They did not have a choice. I replied, my voice steady, though the memory still carried a sharp sting of betrayal. 3 years ago, Brandon decided he was a cryptocurrency savant. He convinced Mom and Dad to let him manage their primary retirement portfolios. He promised them guaranteed double-digit returns. Instead, he heavily leveraged their entire life savings on speculative margin calls and lost absolutely everything in a matter of weeks. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the family estate. They were exactly 90 days away from being physically thrown out onto the street. Harrison leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. And they came to you for a bailout. They came to me crying, I corrected him. They were terrified of losing their social status. They could not bear the thought of their country club friends seeing a foreclosure notice hammered onto their front door. They begged me to use my salary to catch up on the missed mortgage payments, but I refused to just hand them cash. I knew exactly where that money would end up. They would have funneled it right back to Brandon to help him cover his tracks and continue his gambling. So you issued an ultimatum, Harrison deduced, tracing the signature line on the lease agreement with his pen. I offered them a permanent solution, I said. I told them I would not pay their late fees. Instead, I told them a private investment group I worked for was willing to purchase the estate entirely in cash, directly from the bank, satisfying the foreclosure immediately. The condition was that they had to sign over the deed completely. In exchange, the holding company would grant them a lifetime ironclad lease to remain in the property. They could keep their precious social status, and no one would ever know they had lost the house. And they had absolutely no idea that you were the sole owner and chief executive officer of Phoenix Holdings, Harrison asked, marveling at the strategy. None, I confirmed. I used a registered agent service to sign the closing documents. As far as my parents knew, Phoenix Holdings was just a faceless corporate landlord. I drafted a commercial lease agreement setting their monthly rent at exactly $1. I covered the annual property taxes and the extensive maintenance costs out of my own pocket through the company accounts. I saved them from total ruin, and in return, they spent the next 3 years continuing to praise Brandon as a financial genius while publicly calling me a massive disappointment to our family name. Harrison sighed deeply, closing the red folder. The tragic irony is almost poetic. Brandon drained their legitimate wealth, pushing them to the brink of homelessness. You stepped in, utilized your hard-earned capital to secure their physical shelter, and remained completely anonymous to protect their fragile pride. Then, the moment they pass away, Brandon steps right back into the picture, forges a power of attorney, and illegally extracts $500,000 from a shadow lender against a property he forced them to lose 3 years prior. He stole a ghost, I stated coldly. That second mortgage is tied to a completely empty asset profile. When the shadow lender tries to collect on that $500,000 note, they are going to realize they hold a fraudulent lien against a multi-million-dollar corporate asset owned by a forensic accountant. They will immediately refer the entire loan packet to the federal authorities for wire fraud. And the fake eviction notice he handed you, Harrison added, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He effectively documented his own criminal intent to illegally seize a property he does not own, evicting the actual legal owner of that property in the process. When I present the certified deed tomorrow at the will reading, his entire fabricated reality is going to instantly vaporize into nothingness. I want you to read the deed only after he presents his forged documents, I instructed, outlining the exact sequence of events for Friday. Let him put the fake power of attorney on the table. Let him verbally claim ownership in front of all the relatives. Let Naomi brag about liquidating the estate. I want every single person in that room to clearly witness his absolute arrogance before you completely drop the hammer on his entire life. Harrison nodded, a fierce protective glint in his eye. It will be my absolute pleasure, Cassidy. I have practiced law for 4 decades, and I have never seen a family member behave with such unmitigated malice. Watching the federal agents walk through my doors tomorrow will be the definitive highlight of my entire professional career. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored jacket. Make sure the local police are waiting in the lobby to execute the eviction notice simultaneously. When the federal agents take him away for the financial crimes, I want uniform officers escorting Naomi out of my house. I want her designer bags sitting on the curb by the time I get home. Consider it done, Harrison said, standing to shake my hand securely. Get some rest tonight, Cassidy. Tomorrow you reclaim your life completely and permanently. I walked out of the office feeling the heavy weight of the last 3 decades finally begin to lift from my shoulders. The trap was perfectly constructed, thoroughly documented, and legally impenetrable. Brandon had spent his entire life taking exactly what he wanted and leaving me to clean up the wreckage. Tomorrow at noon, he was going to learn a brutal, unforgiving lesson about the true cost of his actions. I was not just going to destroy his fraudulent empire. I was going to erase his golden child legacy permanently from the face of the earth. The drive back to my penthouse was a blur of calculated anticipation. As soon as I walked through my front door, I headed straight for the concealed wall safe located behind a modern art canvas in my master bedroom. The digital evidence was already secured, but Friday required physical, undeniable proof. I needed the paper bullets that would completely shatter Brandon's reality in front of an audience. I entered a 12-digit code and pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside rested a single fireproof lockbox. I carried the lockbox to my dining table and popped the latches. Inside lay a pristine black leather portfolio containing the original notarized documents establishing Phoenix Holdings. Beneath the articles of incorporation lay the absolute crown jewel of my legal arsenal, the residential lease agreement. I carefully pulled the thick stack of premium parchment paper from the folder and spread it across the smooth marble surface of the island. This was not just a standard rental contract. It was a highly customized, ironclad legal instrument drafted by real estate attorneys to ensure absolute anonymity and complete control. I traced my finger over the bold heading at the top of the first page. It explicitly designated Phoenix Holdings as the sole legal landlord and my parents as the designated tenants. I flipped to the third page where the financial terms were laid out in undeniable black and white ink. The monthly rent was legally codified at exactly $1 payable on the first of every month. I had deliberately structured the payment this way to satisfy the legal requirement for consideration in a binding contract without actually burdening them with a financial loss. For 3 consecutive years, I had quietly deposited a single dollar bill into my corporate operating account to maintain the absolute legal validity of this document. My eyes scanned down to the restrictive covenants section. This was the specific legal trapdoor that made Brandon's entire criminal scheme so pathetically hilarious. Clause 7 explicitly prohibited the tenants from subletting, modifying, or leveraging the property in any capacity. It clearly stated that the tenants held absolutely no equity, no ownership rights, and no authority to use the residential estate as collateral for any financial transaction. When Brandon forced our parents to sign that second mortgage paperwork with the predatory shadow lender, he forced them to violate a federal banking statute by pledging an asset they had already legally surrendered on paper 3 years prior. But the most devastating paragraph was Clause 12, the termination of tenancy upon death. The lease explicitly stipulated that the $1 rental arrangement was strictly non-transferable and automatically terminated the exact second the primary tenants passed away. The moment my parents' hearts stopped beating in that tragic car crash, the house instantly reverted to the absolute unencumbered possession of Phoenix Holdings. Brandon had stomped into my mother's bedroom and handed me an eviction notice for a property that legally demanded his immediate removal. He was a trespasser issuing demands to the actual landlord. I stared at the final page of the document, my gaze locked onto the signatures at the bottom. My mother's elegant cursive and my father's sharp block letters rested right next to the signature of the registered corporate agent I hired to conceal my identity. Looking at their handwriting, a profound wave of clarity washed over me. For 3 years, they knew exactly what this document meant. They knew they lost everything to Brandon's reckless gambling. They knew they lived on the quiet charity of a faceless corporation to avoid the crushing public humiliation of foreclosure. Yet they never changed their behavior. They continued to praise Brandon at every holiday dinner, applauding his fake investment firm and turning a blind eye to his obvious financial instability. They continued to belittle me, mocking my quiet lifestyle and calling me a failure because I did not flaunt designer brands or drive a leased sports car. They signed a legal document acknowledging their financial ruin, then spent the next 3 years pretending they were still the wealthy, untouchable aristocrats of their suburban country club. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that hypocrisy was staggering. I felt no lingering sadness looking at their signatures. The grief I felt at the funeral had been entirely replaced by cold, clinical logic. This piece of paper was the ultimate equalizer. It stripped away all the emotional manipulation, all the gaslighting, and all the toxic family dynamics. It reduced 33 years of psychological abuse down to a legally binding, undeniable fact. I owned the ground Brandon walked on. I owned the roof over his head. I held the absolute power to dismantle his life, and I was going to execute that power with ruthless precision. I meticulously organized the physical documents, placing the $1 lease agreement at the very top of the stack. I added the certified deed of trust, proving Phoenix Holdings owned the estate outright. Next went the printed receipt from the Buckhead pawn shop, perfectly showcasing Naomi's grand larceny. Finally, I included high-resolution printouts of the group chat where Brandon confessed to withholding estate assets using his forged power of attorney. I slid the entire stack of perfectly curated destruction into a sleek, unmarked black presentation folder. The physical ammunition was now completely ready for Friday's confrontation. The legal boundaries were drawn and the evidence was insurmountable. I snapped the portfolio shut and placed it carefully into my designer leather briefcase. With the property trap perfectly finalized, there was only one major piece of the execution left to manage. I needed to ensure that the federal authorities were fully briefed and positioned to drop the hammer on his massive cryptocurrency fraud. I walked back into my home office to finish the job. The heavy steel door sealed shut behind me, isolating me once again in my command center. I sat down at my desk, waking the 4 curved monitors from their standby state. The ambient blue light illuminated the room as I opened the encrypted master file I had been compiling all week. Bringing down a massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme requires more than just pointing authorities in the right direction. Federal agencies are notoriously understaffed and overwhelmed with financial crime reports. If you submit a disorganized pile of banking anomalies, it sits in a queue for months. I needed immediate, decisive action. To get that, I had to hand them a fully prosecuted case tied up with a neat digital bow. I launched a specialized reporting template I had developed during my years as a forensic auditor. I divided the dossier into two distinct sections. The first was specifically targeted at the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Unit. The second was engineered entirely for the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Both agencies needed different angles of the exact same fraud to trigger their respective immediate response protocols. I started with the Federal Bureau of Investigation packet. I titled the executive summary with Brandon's full legal name and his primary holding company. I laid out the exact timeline of his financial deterioration, starting with the catastrophic alternative cryptocurrency crash 2 years ago. I attached the trading logs proving he lost $4 million on heavily leveraged margin calls. Then I mapped the subsequent money laundering operation. I created a visually striking flowchart that traced the incoming wire transfers from our extended family members directly into his domestic business accounts. I highlighted the specific deposits from Aunt Beatrice and Cousin Greg. Next, I drew a bright red digital line showing how those exact funds were immediately diverted. A portion went to pay fake dividend returns to older investors, sustaining the illusion of profitability. The rest was aggressively funneled into his personal checking accounts to pay for his leased luxury vehicles and Naomi's designer shopping sprees. To guarantee federal jurisdiction, I emphasized the interstate wire fraud. Brandon was using servers in Delaware and Wyoming to route stolen money to unregulated overseas exchanges. That crossed federal borders, making it an immediate national security interest. I attached the emails where he solicited these investments, proving he explicitly promised high yields while knowing his fund was completely insolvent. I included the final devastating piece of evidence: the text message from the family group chat, where he confessed to forging the power of attorney and planning to illegally liquidate our parents' estate by Monday. With the federal law enforcement packet perfected, I pivoted to the Internal Revenue Service dossier. Tax evasion is often the fastest way to paralyze a financial criminal. Al Capone was not taken down for his street crimes. He was locked away for tax fraud. I opened Brandon's public corporate tax filings from the last 3 years and placed them side by side with his actual hidden ledgers. The discrepancies were massive and undeniably criminal. Brandon had completely failed to report his $4 million offshore deficit. More importantly, he was issuing fake tax documents to his investors, claiming they were receiving legitimate capital gains. He was forcing our relatives to pay taxes on phantom income that did not actually exist. Meanwhile, he was hiding his own stolen income by classifying his personal expenses as corporate marketing deductions. The luxury cars, the expensive dinners, the country club memberships were all illegally written off. I compiled a detailed schedule of his unreported income, calculating exactly how much he owed the federal government in back taxes and severe fraud penalties. The total tax liability exceeded $2 million. The Internal Revenue Service does not take kindly to citizens hiding money offshore, and they react with lethal speed when presented with absolute proof. I reviewed both dossiers one final time. The documentation was flawless. Every claim was supported by bank records, IP addresses, and direct written confessions. I engaged my virtual private network, routing my connection through secure servers in Switzerland and Iceland to maintain absolute anonymity. I accessed the secure digital tipping portals for both federal agencies. I uploaded the encrypted files, ensuring the metadata was wiped clean of my personal identifiers. I filled out the submission forms utilizing the direct contact channels I had established with Special Agent Vance during previous forensic consultations. I knew Vance was aggressive, highly competent, and hungry for airtight convictions. I typed a direct, concise message in the submission box. Target is actively operating a Ponzi scheme and attempting a fraudulent real estate liquidation using forged legal documents. Flight risk is extremely high due to impending margin calls on offshore debt. Target will be physically present at the specified law firm address this Friday at exactly noon to execute the final stage of the estate fraud. All supporting evidence, including written confessions and offshore routing numbers, is attached in the encrypted dossier. Request immediate review for emergency arrest warrants. I took a slow, deep breath and finally hit send. The progress bar tracked across my center monitor, confirming the delivery of the massive files. I watched the confirmation receipts populate in my secure inbox. The trap was officially deployed. There was no turning back. The machinery of the federal government had been activated, and Brandon's entire fabricated reality was hurtling toward a concrete wall at maximum speed. I logged out of the secure portals and disconnected the virtual private network. I sat back slowly in my leather chair, bathing in the quiet glow of my monitors, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of absolute closure finally wash over me. The meticulous preparation was entirely finished, and I had accounted for every detail. Tomorrow morning, I would put on my best armor, walk into that conference room, and watch the spectacular destruction of the Golden Child. Friday morning arrived with the sharp clarity of shattered glass. I woke up precisely at 6 without needing an alarm. There was no lingering dread in my chest and no anxious fluttering in my stomach. For 33 years, the day of any family gathering had filled me with an exhausting sense of impending doom. I used to spend hours mentally preparing to be ignored, belittled, and aggressively compared to Brandon. I used to rehearse polite smiles and practice swallowing insults just to keep the fragile peace our parents demanded. Today was entirely different. Today I was not attending a family gathering. I was attending an execution. I walked into my expansive master bathroom and turned the shower onto its coldest setting. The freezing water hit my skin like a jolt of electricity, washing away the last remaining traces of the obedient, subservient sister I had been forced to play. I stepped out, wrapped myself in a plush towel, and walked directly into my walk-in closet. It was time to select my armor. In the past, my mother explicitly instructed me to wear muted colors and budget brands whenever we went out in public. She claimed it was to teach me humility, but I always knew the real reason. Brandon needed to shine. He needed the designer labels and the expensive watches to project his massive superiority, and my forced plainness provided the perfect contrasting background for his golden child aura. Naomi had laughed at my cheap clothes just 4 days ago when she threw my decoy suitcase into the mud. I smiled at the memory as I bypassed the simple sweaters I kept specifically for family visits. I reached into the protective garment bags housing my professional wardrobe. I pulled out a custom-tailored midnight blue trench coat made from heavy Italian wool. It was a garment that commanded absolute authority. Beneath it, I chose a pristine white silk blouse and razor-sharp, high-waisted trousers. I slid my feet into a pair of classic Christian Louboutin heels. The signature red soles were a subtle, lethal flash of power. I moved to my vanity and applied my makeup with surgical precision. I contoured my cheekbones to look sharp and unforgiving. I applied a deep crimson lipstick that felt like war paint. I secured my hair into a flawless, severe twist at the base of my neck. I looked in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was an apex predator. The sad, grieving clerk they thought they had evicted did not exist anymore. I picked up my designer leather briefcase containing the physical evidence portfolio and headed for the door. My private driver was waiting in the underground garage, standing next to a sleek black car. I slid into the back seat and instructed him to head to the financial district. The city of Atlanta was bustling with morning traffic, but the tinted windows of the car provided a perfectly silent sanctuary. I pulled out my phone to make one final crucial check. I dialed Harrison using his direct line. He answered on the first ring. "Are the guests in place?" "Harrison," I asked, watching the skyscrapers pass by my window. "They are currently gathering in the main conference room," Harrison replied, his voice brimming with professional anticipation. Brandon arrived 20 minutes early with Naomi. He insisted on taking the seat at the head of the table. Aunt Beatrice and cousin Greg arrived shortly after with a few others. They are currently drinking our complimentary coffee and discussing how quickly they expect the estate funds to be dispersed into Brandon's accounts. I felt a cold thrill radiate through my chest. Excellent. And the authorities? Plainclothes federal agents are stationed in the empty office directly across the hall from our conference room, Harrison confirmed. 2 uniformed Atlanta police officers are waiting discreetly in the ground floor security office. They have the eviction notice ready. We are fully armed and operational, Cassidy. I told Harrison I would be there in exactly 10 minutes and ended the call. I leaned back against the headrest and let the silence wash over me. For years, I had deliberately hidden my wealth to avoid becoming my family's personal bank. If Brandon or my parents had ever discovered the 8-figure balance in my corporate accounts, they would have relentlessly demanded I hand it over to fund Brandon's reckless ventures. They would have called it my duty to the family. They would have used guilt manipulation and sheer emotional terrorism to drain my resources. Hiding my success was the ultimate survival mechanism. It allowed me to build my forensic accounting empire in absolute peace, while they happily bought into their own delusional narrative of my failure. Now that same hidden wealth was the very tool that had purchased the ground beneath their feet. The car pulled up to the curb outside the imposing glass and steel structure that housed Harrison's law firm. The driver opened my door. I stepped onto the sunlit pavement, my heels striking the concrete with a sharp rhythm. I adjusted the collar of my navy trench coat and walked confidently through the revolving glass doors. The lobby was a cavernous expanse of polished marble. The security guards nodded respectfully as I passed. They recognized me not as a grieving relative, but as an elite client. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The quiet hum of the ascending car matched the steady beating of my heart. As the digital numbers above the door climbed higher, I visualized the exact layout of the conference room. I knew where Brandon would sit. I knew exactly how Naomi would look at me. I knew the words they would use to try and tear me down. They were completely predictable, operating on a script memorized over decades of unchecked arrogance. The elevator bell chimed softly. The heavy steel doors slid open. I stepped out, ready to face them. I walked down the wide carpeted corridor of the law firm. The glass walls of the main conference room came into view at the end of the hallway. Inside, the scene was exactly as Harrison had described. It looked less like a somber gathering to honor my deceased parents and more like a twisted victory party. Brandon sat squarely at the head of the massive mahogany table. He had unbuttoned his suit jacket, leaning back with his hands clasped behind his head, projecting the relaxed dominance of a king holding court. Naomi sat immediately to his right, wearing a brand new designer dress that she had undoubtedly purchased with the cash from my mother's stolen pearls. Behind them sat the toxic chorus. Two other cousins who had eagerly liked Naomi's fraudulent social media posts were sipping bottled water and laughing at a joke Brandon had just made. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The thick metal hinges glided silently, but the sharp, commanding click of my designer heels on the marble threshold instantly silenced the room. Every head turned in my direction simultaneously. For a fraction of a second, absolute confusion washed over their faces. They were expecting the broken, mud-soaked girl they had violently thrown out into the rain 4 days ago. They were waiting for a pathetic, weeping victim wearing cheap clothes, desperate to beg for scraps from the family table. Instead, they saw a woman radiating lethal authority. I carried a premium leather briefcase that cost more than Brandon's entire leased car payment. "Well, look who decided to show up," Brandon announced, breaking the stunned silence. His voice was loud, bouncing off the glass walls, ensuring his captive audience of relatives heard every single word. I did not respond to his taunt. I walked slowly along the edge of the room, my eyes fixed on the empty chair at the exact opposite end of the table from him. "Did you walk here from whatever budget motel you are staying at?" Naomi chimed in, leaning forward to inspect me. "It is truly pathetic that you felt the need to dress up to pretend you are not completely destitute. You can wear all the expensive coats you want, but you are still just an accounting clerk who leeches off her parents." Aunt Beatrice scoffed loudly from the back row. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here today, young lady. Your brother has been working tirelessly to sort out the massive financial mess your parents left behind. You are an absolute disgrace to this family name." Cousin Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "Just let her sit there, Aunt Beatrice. She is probably hoping Brandon will throw her a couple of $100 out of pity. Too bad Brandon runs a tight ship. We all know you only care about yourself, Cassidy. You never had the discipline or the intelligence to actually succeed at anything real. The sheer volume of their delusion was breathtaking. Every single insult they hurled at me was a direct projection of Brandon's own monumental failures. They called me a thief while sitting next to the woman who pawned my mother's pearls. They called me a financial parasite while praising the man who was actively draining their life savings through a massive cryptocurrency fraud scheme. I placed my leather briefcase on the polished mahogany table and took my seat. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, keeping my facial expression completely blank. I refused to give them the reaction they so desperately craved. They were happily dancing on the edge of a massive legal cliff, completely blind to the drop below. Nothing to say, Brandon taunted, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. He tapped his fingers aggressively. That is probably for the best. You should listen and learn how real adults handle complex financial matters. I brought the power of attorney today, the one Mom and Dad signed, giving me absolute control over the estate. Once the lawyer finishes reading the formalities, I am immediately taking full possession of the house and all remaining liquid assets. I am rolling those funds directly into my investment firm. Naomi smiled, reaching over to stroke Brandon's arm. And since you clearly stole the jewelry, she added, looking directly at me, we are legally deducting the value of those pearls from whatever meager scraps Mom and Dad might have accidentally left you. You are getting absolutely nothing. I suggest you start looking for a second job because we are cutting you off permanently. I kept my eyes locked onto Brandon's face. He firmly believed he had orchestrated the perfect crime. He had convinced the extended family that he was a brilliant savior. He believed he was hours away from cashing out my parents' estate to save his fraudulent offshore accounts from total default. He had no idea that federal agents were currently standing 30 feet away waiting for him to legally present that forged document. Are you quite finished, Brandon? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying enough icy authority to make Cousin Greg shift uncomfortably in his seat. Brandon scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. I am finished with you, yes. We are just waiting on the lawyer to rubber stamp my documents. Then you can go back to whatever pathetic, miserable existence you came from. We have high-level business to conduct today. Right on cue, the side door of the conference room opened. Harrison walked in, carrying a thick legal binder. He looked immaculate, his silver hair perfectly combed, his expression radiating absolute professional detachment. He took his place at the center of the table, placing the heavy binder down with a resounding thud that commanded the entire room's immediate attention. He adjusted his glasses, looking first at Brandon, then at the relatives, and finally offering me a brief, almost imperceptible nod. The bait was fully swallowed, the audience was seated, and the execution was officially underway. Harrison opened the heavy binder and looked around the room. Good afternoon, everyone. He began, his voice projecting absolute authority. We are gathered here to execute the final directives of Thomas and Catherine. Before we begin the formal reading, I must address the documentation placed on the table by Brandon. Brandon puffed out his chest, pushing the forged paper toward the center of the table. That is the only document that matters, Harrison. It is a fully executed power of attorney granting me total control over the entire estate. Just certify it quickly so we can expedite the asset transfer. I have urgent investments to manage for my clients. Harrison did not reach for the paper. He looked at Brandon with a mixture of professional disdain and profound pity. A power of attorney expires the exact second the principal party dies, Brandon. It grants you absolutely no legal authority over a deceased estate. Furthermore, this specific document is a complete fabrication. The room fell dead silent. Naomi dropped her hand from Brandon's arm. What are you talking about? Brandon sputtered, his face flushing dark red. It is notarized. It is stamped with a notary seal that expired 4 years ago, Harrison corrected sharply. The language is pulled from a generic internet template, and it lacks the mandatory state clauses. Presenting this document to a legal officer is a federal offense. I am legally obligated to disregard it entirely. Aunt Beatrice gasped loudly from the back row. Brandon scrambled to recover his footing. Fine, whatever. Read the actual will, then. I am the oldest son. I am the primary beneficiary anyway. Just read the document so I can claim my property and leave. Harrison opened the heavy blue-backed document. There is no traditional will, Brandon. 3 years ago, your parents established the Thomas and Catherine Irrevocable Trust. An irrevocable trust bypasses probate court entirely. Its directives are absolute and immediate. I will now read the primary distribution clause. Harrison cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the page. To our son Brandon, we leave exactly $0.00. We have paid enough of your debts in life, and we are fully aware of the financial ruin you have brought upon this family. Therefore, you are explicitly excluded from any and all estate distributions. The silence in the conference room was absolute. Cousin Greg stared at Brandon in pure shock. Naomi's jaw dropped open. Brandon leaped to his feet, his chair crashing backward against the glass wall. That is a lie, Brandon roared, slamming his fists onto the mahogany table. This is a setup. You and Cassidy manufactured this garbage to steal my inheritance. That house is mine. I made them sign the second mortgage paperwork before they died. I have the legal right to that equity. Harrison calmly pushed a different stack of legal papers across the table. You have absolutely nothing here, Brandon. The family estate does not belong to your parents. It has not belonged to them for 3 years. It belongs entirely to Phoenix Holdings. I do not care about some random shell company, Brandon screamed, his face contorted with raw fury. I will sue Phoenix Holdings into the ground. I will take them to federal court and destroy them. I will seize the property myself. That might be incredibly difficult, Harrison replied, adjusting his glasses and leaning forward. Considering the chief executive officer and sole owner of Phoenix Holdings is sitting right across from you. Brandon and Naomi snapped their heads toward me simultaneously. The color completely drained from Brandon's face as the realization hit him like a freight train. Naomi clutched her designer handbag, her eyes wide with absolute terror as she stared at my tailored navy coat. You? Naomi whispered, her voice trembling violently. Me. I said, my voice smooth and lethal. I opened my designer leather briefcase and pulled out the pristine black presentation folder. I extracted the residential lease agreement and slid it across the polished table directly to Brandon. 3 years ago, when your reckless day trading pushed Mom and Dad 90 days past due on their mortgage, they were terrified of losing their social status. I explained clearly, making sure the relatives in the back row heard every single word. I used my own corporate capital to purchase the estate in cash from the bank to save them from foreclosure. I allowed them to rent the house from my company for exactly $1 a month to save their pride. Brandon stared at the lease agreement, his eyes darting frantically across the signatures. When Mom and Dad passed away, their tenancy automatically terminated. I continued my gaze, locking onto his panicked eyes. You forged a legal document to seize a house that already belonged to me. The second mortgage you fraudulently forced them to sign with that predatory shadow lender is completely void because they did not hold the deed. You committed federal bank fraud against a property owned by my corporate entity. Brandon was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving as his entire fabricated reality collapsed around him. I reached into my folder and slid one final document across the table. That is a formal court-ordered eviction notice for trespassing on private corporate property. You and your wife have exactly 2 hours to remove your belongings from my house before the Atlanta police physically drag you out onto the street. You cannot do this to us, Naomi shrieked, jumping up and pointing a manicured finger at me. She turned wildly to the relatives sitting behind them, desperately trying to regain control of her shattered narrative. Do not listen to her. She stole Catherine's vintage jewelry after the funeral. She drained the bank accounts. Everyone saw my social media post. Everyone knows she is a thief. We even had to set up a fundraising campaign to pay for the burial. I did not blink. I opened my bag to pull out the verified luxury consignment receipt for the pearls. I tossed the crisp piece of paper directly onto the polished mahogany table. It slid effortlessly across the smooth surface and came to a complete stop right in front of Aunt Beatrice. No, Naomi, I stated loudly, making sure my voice pierced through her hysterical shouting. You stole them. 3 days before the funeral, while my parents' bodies were still at the county medical examiner's office, You walked into a luxury consignment dealer in the wealthy Buckhead district and sold them. You sold the vintage pearl necklaces belonging to my mother for $12,000 in raw cash. You signed that exact receipt sitting on the table. The police have already recovered the pearls from the dealer. You are currently facing grand larceny charges. The relatives in the back row began to murmur in absolute horror. Aunt Beatrice picked up the receipt. Her hands shook violently as she recognized the signature of Naomi at the bottom of the page. Cousin Greg eyed Brandon, his face twisting in disgust. "You lied to us," Greg said, his voice rising in anger. "That fundraising campaign you all shared was nothing but a fraudulent cash grab," I explained calmly. "I traced the internet protocol addresses and the routing numbers from that viral post Naomi created. The money you donated did not go to a funeral home or an estate account. It was routed directly into an offshore cryptocurrency exchange wallet registered under the maiden name of Naomi. She used your sympathy to buy those designer stilettos she is wearing right now." Naomi took a frantic step backward. Her back hit the glass wall of the conference room hard. She pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. She tapped the screen frantically, desperately clinging to her modern gaslighting tactics. But her face dropped. Her social media accounts had been permanently suspended. The fundraising platform had frozen the campaign completely due to the fraudulent activity reports I filed earlier that morning. Her digital echo chamber was entirely gone. "You are a complete monster, Cassidy," Brandon roared, completely ignoring the absolute panic of his wife. He lunged forward across the table, knocking over a glass of water, his eyes burning with blind hatred. Before he could reach me, the heavy wooden doors swung open wide. Two tall men wearing dark suits and federal badges clipped to their belts stepped quickly into the room. Right behind them were two uniformed Atlanta police officers. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Brandon, the lead federal agent, said, his voice echoing authoritatively in the tense space. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated bank fraud, and operating an illegal financial Ponzi scheme. Put your hands behind your back immediately." Pandemonium broke out instantly. Aunt Beatrice and Cousin Greg jumped out of their seats screaming at Brandon. "What scheme?" Greg shouted, his face turning bright red. "What about our retirement money?" "Where is our money, Brandon?" "I provided the federal authorities with a comprehensive financial audit," I announced over the shouting. "Brandon lost $4 million in an offshore cryptocurrency crash 2 years ago. He has been taking your new investments and using them to pay fake dividend returns to his older investors. Your retirement funds are entirely gone. He used your life savings to lease his sports cars and pay for his exclusive country club monthly memberships." Brandon was violently yanked backward by the federal agents. His arms were forced behind his back extremely fast. The cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around his wrists. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terror that was deeply and profoundly satisfying. He finally understood. I had exposed absolutely everything. He had leveraged a second mortgage on a house he did not legally own, and he had stolen millions from our own relatives. "Cassidy, please," Brandon begged, his arrogant facade completely shattered. "Tell them the truth. Help me out of this. You are my sister and I need you now." I stood up slowly, buttoning my tailored navy coat. I looked down at the totally defeated man. He was the man who had tormented me for my entire life, the golden child who had thrown my belongings into the rain just days ago. I felt absolutely nothing for him. "Like you said, Brandon," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of emotion. "Enjoy the streets." As the agents dragged a sobbing, hyperventilating Brandon out of the conference room, I watched Naomi frantically trying to slip her diamond wedding ring off her finger. She was desperately attempting to distance herself from the rapidly sinking corporate ship. She was calculating how much cash she could possibly get today. She needed to sell the ring before authorities seized her personal assets too. One of the uniformed police officers approached her, presenting a separate warrant for the stolen estate jewelry. The relatives who had cursed my name 48 hours ago were now crowding around Harrison, crying and begging for answers about their stolen life savings. They were turning on each other, blaming Aunt Beatrice for convincing them to invest, screaming about the ultimate betrayal. The toxic family unit was consuming itself in real time. I did not stay to watch the bloody carnage. I calmly picked up my bag. I grabbed my designer briefcase, walked out of the chaotic conference room, and stepped into the quiet elevator. When I walked out of the grand lobby and into the bright Atlanta afternoon, the air felt incredibly clean and fresh. I had lost my parents, but I had finally excised the toxic cancer that had infected my family for decades. I got into my waiting private car, instructed the driver to take me home, and for the first time in 33 years, I was completely and truly free. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe today. Thank you. The story of Cassidy's triumph over her toxic family serves as a powerful testament to the value of silent resilience and the absolute necessity of establishing unbreakable personal boundaries. When faced with ultimate betrayal and cruelty, the most common human instinct is to react emotionally, to scream, to desperately defend oneself, or to beg for understanding from those who are determined to misunderstand you. However, the profound lesson embedded in this narrative is that emotional reactions are the exact currency that manipulators thrive on. By refusing to engage in their theatrical drama, you strip toxic individuals of their stolen power. Cassidy's journey clearly demonstrates that true strength does not roar, it meticulously prepares. While her brother and extended relatives reveled in their fabricated reality and public smear campaigns, she anchored herself in undeniable truths and cold, hard facts. She understood that defending her character to people committed to her villainy would be a completely useless expenditure of her energy. Instead, she channeled her grief and anger into strategic protective action. She allowed her abusers' own monumental arrogance and greed to become the very instruments of their spectacular downfall. This narrative beautifully reminds us that we are never obligated to set ourselves on fire to keep our families warm, nor must we endure ongoing abuse under the guise of traditional familial loyalty. Shared bloodlines do not excuse financial exploitation, psychological manipulation, or blatant cruelty. True justice often comes simply from stepping back, removing the safety nets you have secretly provided, and allowing destructive people to finally face the natural consequences of their own disastrous choices. Your self-worth is never defined by those who are inherently incapable of recognizing it. Evaluate the boundaries in your own life today and firmly cut ties with anyone who demands your peace of mind as the price for their conditional love.